Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Educate session of the Global Engagement Summit. I hope it's off to a great start. I know we've heard from wonderful speakers so far. So, thank you so much for joining the Untangling the UN session. One of the things that when I first joined, kind of working in and around the UN, I was very confused by what I like to call the alphabet of the UN, all of the ABCs. Today, we are joined by Aish Machani, our Next Generation Fellow at UN Foundation, and Robb Skinner, Deputy Director and Chief of Partnerships and Global Engagement at the United Nations. This session today is really meant to be interactive. So strongly encourage you to please use the chat. We'll be kind of keeping an eye on it. We also want to make sure that you are, pitching in. We're going to kick off with a couple of questions, and the questions will not just be for our panelists, but also for you. So please do jump in. As I mentioned, one of the things that really surprised me about the UN is how complicated it is. It has departments, agencies, funds, programs, offices, field offices, peacekeeping missions, and somehow they're structured under what they call six organs. So, for the first question to our panelists, can you name the organs of the United Nations system?
To step in first to answer that. Shall I take three, Robin? Do you want to take the other three?
Yes, please, Aish, go for it. Yeah.
Great. I guess I have the easier job, but I'll go with General Assembly, the Secretariat, and the Security Council.
Ding, ding, ding.
Yeah, those kind of were the easy ones, Aish. But yeah, I think that I have an unfair advantage because I'm sitting in my office, right? And I have stuff in my office that gives me the answer to these questions, and I should have probably covered them up before we got the session started. So I feel a little bit like I'm cheating to get the other three because I confess that I can see them, but before I name them and before we go to the audience here and have them talk about and think about the organs, I do want to recognize, and I think the other speakers we've heard from the UN today and otherwise have mentioned that this is actually a tough day for the organs of the United Nations as well as for the world, and particularly for Ukraine. And so, I mean, that's certainly on all of our minds here in the UN today. I mean, I think the Secretary General has spoken on the situation several times today and just put out another statement today about the fact that the UN can continue its humanitarian and actually ramp up its humanitarian efforts in Ukraine, as we're already seeing the suffering and sort of the horror of what's happening there. So, and he's been very clear in his statements over the last couple of days about the violations of the UN Charter with the action that's being taken. And I'm one of those UN geeks that always does have the Charter with him, which is another cheat sheet for the six organs. But it is clearly in violation of the Charter what's happening, and I think that it should concern us all as we go forward. But as we think about the other organs, and as I said, I have all these cheating things, but there are, I believe, Aish, you said General Assembly, Security Council, and Secretariat, correct? Mm-hmm. And there is one that I spent a lot of time working with in my role here at the United Nations, is the Economic and Social Council, which is clearly important around sustainable development issues, and many of the issues that we think about with climate change and just equality and development. A lot of the sustainable development goals actually fall within the purview of the Economic and Social Council. And then the couple that would be probably the most difficult to get are the International Court of Justice. And I reference the charter, my sort of battered charter of the United Nations here. It's easy to say, and statute of the International Court of Justice. So that's right there on the cover of the charter. Was there from the beginning. And then the last one, which is even probably more difficult, is the Trusteeship Council, which basically doesn't function anymore. The Trusteeship Council did its work. and stopped functioning, I believe, in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken. Although it does have a beautiful chamber that it still exists here at UN headquarters in New York. It's a very nice room that is the trusteeship council that is used for many other functions still. So sorry for taking so long, but I do think all of our thoughts really need to be on what's happening in Ukraine, and it's hard to avoid. So apologies.
No, for sure. And thank you, Rob, for acknowledging the situation that, as you mentioned, is very much on everyone's minds. And I think, as we kind of continue throughout this session today, we think about, the UN just being that big building on East 42nd Street and First Avenue. There's clearly so many bits and pieces. And how does this huge, institution work, based all over the world to address situations like the one that we're seeing today? So thank you. I'm also seeing in the chat, there's definitely a lot of answers there. We also have a lot of UN gurus joining us today. So that's wonderful to see. So with that, then I will move on to the next question, which is, have you been to any of the 4 UN offices? If so, which ones? And I'm also going to look in the chat.
I would say I would look at the chat first, because again, that feels a little unfair for me.
Sounds good. I'm going to wait and see and wait until the answers come in. I will say that I've been to 2 of the 4. One maybe because I live in New York, but that just happens to be. So I see here Sarmat has been to New York and Geneva. Those are the same ones that I have been to. Wonderful. I wonder if others have been to the other 2 locations. I won't say where, because I would love for all of our UN gurus and our panelists to let us know. Okay. A lot of people have been to New York and Geneva. Aish, have you been to any of the other 2? Or you, Rob?
I have actually never been to any of the offices, so it's all a bit new to me. I'm very much, I think, due to actually be coming to New York in a couple of weeks, so that will be really, really exciting. Actually stepping into the halls of the kind of buildings that I've dedicated the last 2 years working on. So yeah, I can see. I think the chat seems to have got that with the others potentially.
Yep, a lot of New York. But really looking forward to you coming to New York, though. How about you, Rob?
I have been to all of them, all 4 of them, yeah, and Vienna and Nairobi.
Yep.
And yeah, they're all quite fascinating, interesting places, and they're all different. It's a different vibe in each of the places, which you expect, not just because they're in different places, but because of the issues and the entities that are housed in the different headquarters buildings. It's quite interesting.
For sure. And I'm again kind of looking in the chat. It seems as if most of our members have been to New York, some to Geneva. We do have one member that's been to 3 of the 4, which is really exciting. But hopefully at one point I can also visit the other 2. Who knows? We will see.
And I should say, please visit us when you come in a couple of weeks, and come see us here in the Department of Global Communications.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's exactly right.
I would say that because the one thing that we do oversee in the Department of Global Communications is visitor services. So all visitors that come to the UN and take tours or just come in into the visitors areas are being hosted by my colleagues with the tour guides and the folks that work in the visitor center.
Great. So then the next question is, which of the 6 official UN languages can you speak? I can speak 4 of them, not fluently, but I'll stress that point. But I would love to hear again from both of you and our colleagues in the chat.
I think I'm slightly ashamed to say I can confidently speak English. The rest are a bit tricky. Again, I'll leave it to the chat to figure out the rest, but I did do French to kind of passable standard out of school, and I don't really think it counts anymore.
I can do obviously. Maybe not obviously English, but but I can do passable French and Spanish if pressured. Both of which I learned while I was in the Foreign Service when I was with the State Department. I'm at the Foreign Service Institute, when I speak to student groups, and I presume there are probably some students in this group here, The one of the questions I'm often asked is to prepare for a career in international relations at the UN or in the Foreign Service, what do you recommend? The one thing I recommend that I sincerely regret is I didn't get a language coming in, and I didn't take seriously the importance of having additional languages beyond English. I mean, as an American, I think we get a bit spoiled because everyone else, that I work with here speaks fluent English, in many cases better than I do, whether it's their third, fourth, or fifth language. But if you're thinking about what you should study, besides thinking about international relations and those kinds of courses, do your best to get another language.
For sure,
I
for sure.
completely echo that. It's been couldn't agree with that more.
Correct. And I'm seeing some answers in the chat, English, Spanish, and I see other languages as well outside of the 6 official UN languages. I see Russian as well. Okay. And so for me, English and Spanish, I speak fluently. My French, even though I studied for about 8 years, is comme ci, comme ça. And my Arabic, I've tried to brush up on. I think what's really nice is for those who work at the UN or work for the permanent missions of the UN as of member states, as I do, we do have access to classes, language classes, which I've tried to, again, brush up on my Arabic, but very, very basic, I will say. But wonderful to see that there's so many bilingual and trilingual colleagues in the chat today with us.
Yeah, very impressive.
For sure, for sure. Now, the last question before we kind of move on to Q&A is, out of all the areas of the UN system, so we talked about the agencies, the funds, the programs, the different offices, the commissions, peacekeeping missions, so on and so forth. Out of all of these parts of the UN system, what is your favorite and why? And that might be a tricky one because there's so many, and I know that I have a few, and I was trying to narrow it down to one.
Aish, are you going to go? Go ahead.
I'll go first. I also had a long think about this. So okay, I'm going to cheat slightly and then mention two kind of bodies. So the first, actually, I'm going to just give a kind of shout out to the Trusteeship Council that Rob mentioned earlier on. It's obviously slightly obsolete now in that it hasn't got a clear role, but I think it's a kind of exciting body in that I think it actually could have a lot of potential to do some exciting things going forward. So for example, in a recent report by the Secretary General, which is called Our Common Agenda, it's a great read about, the vision of the kind of future of global cooperation. If you haven't read it, the Secretary General kind of put forward the idea of maybe reforming the Trusteeship Council so that it represents and kind of considers the needs of future generations, which is a really interesting idea. And I mean, I think current data suggests that there's going to be about 10.9 billion people born by the end of this century. That's more people than are currently alive today. So I think it's a really important group of people that need to be accounted for that maybe we're not doing enough for at the moment. So that's kind of one. I think the second one I had to think about is actually the UN AIDS program, just because it's got a really interesting structure. It actually brings together 11 other UN bodies in its kind of coordination, and I think that's really interesting because as we kind of mentioned, there's so many different UN bodies, agencies, etc., and there's a risk that sometimes things get duplicated. But by bringing together all of these efforts, I think the UN AIDS program is a really interesting model for action in the UN.
Great, thank you so much, Aish. Rob, over to you.
Yeah, I think I'd probably be, if any of my colleagues were watching, I'd probably have to say the Department of Global Communications is my favorite department, since that's where I work, and then working for the Secretariat in terms of the principal organs that you already talked about. So that would be my obvious answer. But I truly believe in the General Assembly and hope that the General Assembly can become a bit of a stronger organ. I mean, I think folks probably know, because a lot of international affairs students, I'm sure, and folks who have studied over the years, but the Security Council is the only body that makes law in international law within the UN system. The General Assembly doesn't, but the General Assembly does carry a great deal of sort of moral weight in its decisions. And I think that that's critical, and I would like to see a further strengthening of the General Assembly, because it is, every country with one vote. It's the most democratic of the institutions of the UN in terms of member states, and so although there's debates around that too, based on populations of the member states and things like that. But I think that it's when you look to the UN, you look to that voice of the world coming together and speaking. The General Assembly is where it happens.
For sure. Thank you, Rob. And I'm just going to take a quick peek at the chat. I see some really good comments coming in. One is the Office for Information Communications Technology. I did see, of course, someone put in the UN Security Council. Someone also mentioned UN peacekeeping. I would say for me, I would probably go with well, two bids. I'm going to cheat a little bit. So the first would be the Department of Management, Strategy, Policy, and Compliance. That's within the Secretariat. I'm a bit of a nerd because I'm very interested in the processes and structures of how the institution is run. For that particular department, though, it's for just the Secretariat, but it's very interesting to me, and I find it incredibly fascinating how you manage, such a large number of staff people. Then I would say probably within the General Assembly, I would pick, if I had to be specific, the Fifth Committee, which is one of the parts of the General Assembly that's kind of, brought together by member states, and they negotiate the management and the finances of the UN. I think it's really important, when we think about the work of the agencies, funds, and programs that some of our colleagues have mentioned here in the chat. A lot of that is funded through, what happens in the Fifth Committee and kind of the budgets that are agreed, and how can the institution run without money? So for me, those are kind of a bit nerdy, but the ones that I really enjoy. Great. So thank you so much for participating in that little quiz. And thank you to our attendees as well. We're now going to move over to the Q&A section. And just keeping an eye on time, I'm going to ask one question and then really open it up to everyone who's been watching today. So with that, when we think about kind of untangling the UN, what did you both learn, as you became closer to its work and impact? Again, I think we've recognized how complicated the institution is. So again, it would be really wonderful to hear from you. How did you become closer to its work and impact, and what did you learn? Maybe Aish, I see you nodding, so I'm not sure if maybe you want to take it first.
That's actually me thinking about it very carefully. If it's okay, I'm going to defer to Rob first, maybe just because you've been there slightly longer and have a few more lessons to share, and then I'll share what little I can from the brief time I've been working with the UN.
Sounds good. Over to you, Rob.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Mylene. I've seen the UN from a lot of different perspectives. My first encounter with the UN was when I was at the U.S. mission to the UN. I was there from 2002 to 2004, and then from 2006 to about 2015, I was with the UN Foundation here in New York, where UNA USA is currently housed. So I have a long history with UNA USA and the UN Foundation, and then I saw it as a UN staff member first. As the director of the UN Information Center in Washington, and then here in headquarters in a couple of different roles. So what I've learned is it takes a long time to learn precisely the roles and functions of all the different entities that fit on this very complicated diagram, which is my other cheat sheet here, that is the org chart of the UN. And it's a slide that I never try and show people who are not that familiar with the UN, because it is overwhelming. And so when I started the U.S. mission to the UN, I did not have a great grounding in the UN itself, and it worked mostly with the Security Council in my role in the press section, press and public affairs section of the mission. And still, even as I left, I did not have a great grounding in the broad UN system. That really happened when I went to the UN Foundation, and working in the UN Foundation New York office is where I really had to learn the different agencies, funds, programs that the foundation worked with and funded, at that time. And that's really where I started to figure out just what a complicated entity it is. But I don't want to get bogged down in the complexities of it, because every component within the UN does have a function and mandate that it carries out, and in my view, carries out very well. I think of UNHCR and refugees, World Food Program. I mean, these have been developed and established over time to meet specific needs in the world, and have become, very critical entities as we think about, delivering humanitarian assistance, and UNDP working towards sustainable development in the SDGs, and all the entities working together. And I think that one thing that's happening right now in the UN reform space is to try and particularly at the country level, because the vast majority of people who work for the UN aren't sitting here with me in this building in New York. They're scattered around the world in many of the most difficult places in the world. That's where we're coordinating better and working together better to have all those entities, as we say at the UN, delivering as one. And that's really our focus, is delivering what people need around the world, but delivering it in is the least complicated and most comprehensive way as we can. So I would say don't spend too much time on the complexities. If you're looking at working for the UN or supporting the UN or working with the UN somehow, look at the issue that you care about the most and then identify the entities that work in that space.
Really, really great tips. Thank you, Rob. Aish, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, completely echo that. I've been working in the kind of youth space for a while, and I haven't necessarily grasped an understanding of every single body in the UN, but I feel like I have a clear mapping of the bodies that work directly with and for youth, and that's really helpful at the moment. I think my lesson, kind of working with the UN, is that you don't actually have to work in the UN to be able to influence decisions that are made. In many ways, it's the action that's kind of happening on the outskirts, kind of in civil society organizations, in youth mobilization actions, and kind of all of that is equally important. So if you don't get your like dream job at the UN, that doesn't mean that you can't play a really important role in affecting decisions that are made there, and changing, bringing about change that you want to.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I just want to briefly touch on a point that Rob made. I think, Rob, you're right. The UN is incredibly complicated and it deals with so many issues. But I think what's beautiful about the UN, despite it being so large and complex, is that there's a lot of, interrelatedness on the different issues, and a lot of the agencies, funds, and programs, and all of the different pieces do work together. Not perfectly, but it's improving, which is good. And so, yeah, and I see just a couple of questions on kind of finding jobs at the UN. I just want to put in a quick plug. There will be a salon, I believe, at 5 p.m. on working in the UN. So I strongly encourage you all to hop in there and learn a little bit more about getting into careers at the UN. So I think we have a couple of audience questions, and we have maybe about 7 minutes. So we have a question here from Aisha. How can high school students get connected to the various opportunities the UN has? Maybe Rob, over to you first, and then Aish.
Yeah, and I'll take that answer back to Aisha's answer to the last question. Is you don't have to work for the UN to work on UN issues, and I think that's a significant component of the Sustainable Development Goals, and the way we think about the SDGs is not belonging to the UN, although they were created at the UN. The member states adopted them in 2015, but they're everybody's goals, and we always talk about that. The 17 goals cover a lot of ground, and there are ways to engage with them. And I think there's also a question about engage in the chat around engaging at community level. And the one thing I say, and I'll be honest, one of the things that sometimes I'm frustrated with working at UN headquarters is we're sometimes feel a bit isolated just talking about policies and not delivering these things on the ground. My colleagues are. My colleagues are out in the world doing that. But here sitting in New York, sometimes it feels a little distant. And so my answer to that is get engaged in the community, whether it's hunger. Hunger issues exist everywhere, whether it's gender equality. We're still, far from being completely successful on gender equality. Whether it's working on to make greener cities or greener communities. Work on trying to establish opportunities there. Work within if you're working, work within your business to make sure that the organization you work for is doing the right thing around transitioning to sustainable practices and green energy practices and those kinds of things. If you're a student, make sure your schools are doing that. Just be engaged with the community on these things that matter. And what the SDGs are, the Sustainable Development Goals, are a roadmap that lays out the issues we should be thinking about and working on, and then take those ideas and take them into the community level, which I think is where the SDGs and everything we talk about is going to be delivered. At headquarters, the policies get set by the governments. Those of us that work here try and think about them at a global level and what needs to be done. But for me, I think it's clear that they're going to be delivered at community level, working with city governments, working with NGOs, civil society organizations, foundations, and just in communities, in groups of citizens themselves.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that's really where the change happens. As you kind of mentioned, you have kind of these big, fancy talks at the UN. Yes, they're important, but really the change is us here, all of you out there that are mobilizing in your local communities with businesses, your schools, places of faith, and so many other stakeholders that really help push forward what the UN is about. So thank you for your continued engagement, because it's incredibly important. Aisha, I don't know if maybe you have something to chime in on that question.
Maybe just a quick point as someone that's recently been, out of university and kind of looking for job opportunities myself. I would say the easiest way, as Rob said, is to kind of pick an issue area that you're interested in and look at the UN agency that kind of works on that issue, and then find job opportunities and internship opportunities within that kind of body, rather than trying to find kind of overarching UN ones. I think that can often be more interesting. Just a point to say that sadly, a lot of UN internships are unpaid, so it does mean that it's not accessible to everyone. And with that in mind, I kind of just really want to double down on what Rob said, and kind of echoing the idea that there are other avenues of being involved and advancing progress on the SDGs, even if you can't, as sadly most people can't work for free for 6 months or something. But you definitely can make a difference anyway.
I could say, Aisha, I would really love if we could change that so the internships could be paid, because you're exactly right. It does make it inaccessible for a lot of people. I mean, New York's not a cheap city to live in.
Not at all. Great, thank you. Claire, we probably have time for maybe one more question. Okay, so we have a question from Saida. Which languages are recommended for a career in international affairs in the UN?
Well, I would say, I mean, everyone should look first to the 6 official languages, for sure: English, Spanish, French, Russian, Mandarin, Chinese, and Arabic. I think I got all 6 there. But we're working hard to go beyond that. I mean, those 6 can cover a lot of ground, but they don't cover everybody in the world. So a lot of what we're doing in global communications is we've kind of unofficially added Hindi, Kiswahili, and Portuguese. And then I'm going to reference one of the programs I've worked on for the last couple of years, the Verified Initiative, which was to fight mis and disinformation, particularly around the COVID-19 pandemic, which we're all hoping we're going to start recovering from soon. Is some, at least in many places, the numbers seem to be going that way. But we've tried to make sure we're working in more languages, so we're getting to communities that may not have those languages, and work in local languages too. So we think very broadly about languages, but I mean, we still are pushed by the member state to operate in the official 6, in those other 6 that would probably be most recognized if you're putting in an application for a position.
Correct. And I would say something that I have seen more of, kind of, from information that does come out from the UN, particularly the Secretariat, but also the agency's funds and programs, is communications in American Sign Language, but also Braille. And I think that's incredibly important, really making sure that what comes from the UN is accessible for all people. And so it's really great to see that there's, again, kind of a more push to recognize other forms of communication as well. Aisha, it looks like you maybe have a quick something to chime in on this as well.
Yeah, just a quick one.
Please.
Completely agree. I mean, I think those 6 languages are a great way to start, and really important to make sure that we're being accessible. One thing to add, and it's not just relevant for working in the UN, but making sure that you're kind of up to date with your kind of digital communication skills is always really helpful. And if you can learn kind of coding languages, I'm sure that will be appreciated in any job that you take in the UN or otherwise.
For sure. And with that, unfortunately, we are at time. So big thank you to both Rob and Aish for joining us today. Thank you to everyone who's kind of participated in the chat and helping us untangle this UN that, we all love and want to work and kind of make it better. There are a couple of links that will be put in the chat shortly. Just again, one of them actually is to that wonderful chart that Rob showed. So that to help slightly untangle it, make a little bit more sense of how the UN works and all of its different pieces. So again, thank you so much. Strongly encourage you to check out the salons to continue networking, participating, engaging with us as the moderator and presenters, but also with each other. Thank you so much for joining the Untangling the UN session. Take care.